At 62, I thought the hardest day of my life would be burying my husband. But I was wrong. Because as the lilies wilted beside Robert's casket, my own son leaned close, his voice sharp enough to cut through grief, and called me senile. And worse, he wasn't grieving his father. He was already reaching for the $52 million inheritance, as if my dignity and my marriage of 40 years meant nothing. In that moment, I realized I hadn't just lost my husband. I was about to lose my family, too. I stood near the front, my hands twisting the hem of my black dress, trying to keep my composure. Friends and neighbors whispered condolences, their voices hushed, their eyes glancing at me with pity. My daughter Olivia held tightly to my arm, her 33 years slipping away in that moment as she pressed her cheek to my shoulder like she was still a child. She whispered, "Mom, I'm here. We'll get through this together." Her words trembled with sincerity, and for a fleeting moment I felt supported, understood. Then there was Daniel. My son had always carried himself with a kind of restless ambition. But that day at 35, he looked more like a man in a hurry than a grieving son. He shook hands briskly, nodded stiffly at relatives, and avoided standing still long enough to let the sorrow catch up with him. His eyes darted around the room, past the flowers, past the photographs of his father building Miller & Sons construction, from the ground up in 1987, past even the casket. It was as if Robert's death was merely a logistical inconvenience, another item on a long list of business matters to be handled. I watched the way he tugged at his suit jacket, glanced at his watch, and leaned in to speak to a colleague from the construction industry, rather than embrace his grieving family. When the pastor spoke about Robert's dedication, about how he poured every ounce of his life into building not just a company, but a legacy, I saw Daniel's jaw tighten. My husband's legacy was still warm in the air, and already my son seemed to be staking a claim. People came and went, their footsteps muffled by the carpet, their murmurs blending with the low notes of the organ. I accepted hug after hug, nodding politely, hearing the same words. He was a good man. He'll be missed. Stay strong. Each condolence felt like a pebble added to the weight I carried. Olivia stayed by my side, wiping her eyes now and then, guiding me through the line of mourners. Daniel, though, hovered on the edges, his mind elsewhere. When the crowd began to thin and the last of the visitors drifted out into the crisp Colorado air, I finally let my shoulders slump. The silence of the nearly empty room pressed down harder than the flowers or the music ever had. Olivia leaned close, whispering, "You should sit, Mom. Let me get you some water." Her kindness wrapped around me like a shawl. That's when Daniel approached his shoes, clicking against the floor with a finality that set my nerves on edge. He didn't sit, didn't even soften his voice. He looked at me, then at the casket, then back at me with that calculating stare he inherited from no one in my family. He said almost casually, "Don't worry, Mom. I'll take care of everything." At first I thought maybe he meant the paperwork, the arrangements, the awful little details that follow death. But then he added, "From now on, all of Dad's assets, the company, the money, everything, belongs to me." I froze. Olivia's head snapped up, her eyes wide with disbelief. My breath caught somewhere between a gasp and a cry, but no sound came out. Daniel's words hung there cold and unapologetic, as though my husband's body wasn't still lying a few feet away. He straightened his tie as if sealing the statement and gave me a small nod, almost like a businessman closing a deal. Then he turned and walked toward the doors, leaving me standing there with my daughter, with my husband's memory, and with a sudden hollow ache that went deeper than grief. I could still hear his voice echoing in my ears as the doors closed behind him, the words sinking into me like ice. "Everything belongs to me." I stood in silence, stunned, unable to move, while Olivia tightened her grip on my arm, her voice barely above a whisper. "Mom, did he really just say that I couldn't answer?" I just stared at the casket, at the flowers Robert would have hated, at the life that had slipped away from me in more ways than one. And in that moment I knew. Losing my husband was only the beginning of what I was about to face. The morning after the funeral, I woke to silence that felt heavier than grief. For 35 years, I had shared a bed, a kitchen, and a life with Robert. And now the house in Boulder felt cavernous, every corner echoing with the absence of his voice. I sat at the edge of the bed, staring at my hands. These were the hands that had once graded papers when I taught English at the high school, the same hands that had given that career up when Robert asked if I would help with the books at Miller & Sons Construction. I agreed without complaint because back then it felt like our dreams were shared. He worked the job sites. I kept the ledgers. Together we built something stable, something for our children. I remembered the late nights making coffee while Robert drafted bids at the kitchen table, and how I'd fall asleep with the calculator still in my lap. I had set aside the idea of finishing my master's degree, promising myself there would be time later. That later never came. Instead, I poured everything into supporting Robert's vision, believing we were building not just a business but a life our son and daughter could inherit with pride. I was still lost in thought when Daniel arrived, his knock sharp and impatient. He didn't bother waiting for me to open the door before stepping inside. He carried a leather folder under his arm and smelled faintly of cologne and coffee as though he had just come from a meeting rather than his father's funeral. "Mom," he said, his voice brisk, "we need to take care of some paperwork. It'll make things easier for you." I gestured for him to sit, but he remained standing, already opening the folder. "This is a power of attorney," he explained, sliding a stack of papers across the coffee table. "It'll give me control over the financial accounts and the business. You won't have to worry about bills, investments, or anything complicated. I'll handle it all." I stared at the papers, the neat legal language blurring before my eyes. My throat tightened. "Daniel," I said slowly, "I'm not ready to sign anything. Your father hasn't even been gone a week." His jaw tightened. "That's exactly why we should move quickly. If we delay, there could be complications with the estate. It's in everyone's best interest to act now." Before I could answer, Olivia walked in carrying a grocery bag. She froze when she saw her brother standing there with papers in hand. "What's this?" she asked, setting the bag on the counter. "Business." Daniel replied curtly. "I'm helping Mom get things sorted." Olivia crossed her arms. "Helping or taking over?" She looked at me. "Mom, don't sign anything until you talk to an attorney. Dad would want you to be careful." Daniel let out a short laugh, dismissive. "Oh, come on, I'm her son. Who else should she trust? Olivia, you don't know the first thing about running a company." The tension between them filled the room like static. I pressed my hand against my forehead. "Daniel, I appreciate your concern, but I won't sign today. I need time." His expression hardened, but he didn't argue further. He snapped the folder shut, slipped it under his arm again, and said, "Fine, but don't wait too long, Mom. Delays could cost us everything Dad worked for." After he left, Olivia knelt beside me, taking my hands in hers. "Promise me you won't let him pressure you," she whispered. I nodded, though the weight in my chest grew heavier. A few days later, I found myself standing at the checkout counter in the grocery store, my cart filled with nothing more than bread milk and some apples. When I handed the cashier my card, the screen flashed red. Declined. My cheeks burned as people lined up behind me. I tried again. Declined. Finally, fumbling with my purse, I paid in cash. I knew there had been money in that account. Back home, I logged into the bank website only to find the account inaccessible. Panic crept up my spine. When I called the bank, they informed me that the account had been temporarily frozen pending estate review. My stomach turned cold. That evening, Daniel appeared again as though on cue. He handed me a plain envelope, thick but not reassuring. Here, he said, inside was a few $100s in cash. This should cover your expenses for now. I stared at the bills, humiliation prickling my skin. What happened to my account? It's complicated, he said smoothly. The bank flagged it, but don't worry, I'll manage things. You don't really need much, Mom. Just food, gas, little things. His words cut sharper than the lack of money. Just little things. As if my life had been reduced to scraps of cash doled out at his convenience. I pushed the envelope back toward him. I'm not a child who needs an allowance, I said quietly. Viso. He smirked, the corner of his mouth curling with something colder than amusement. Mom, you have to face it. You're not as sharp as you used to be. Let me handle everything. You'll thank me later. The phrase lingered like poison in the air. You're not as sharp as you used to be. He didn't call me senile outright, not yet, but the implication stung just as deeply. I sat there after he left, staring at the envelope of cash, my chest aching. Olivia was right. I needed to be careful. But part of me, the part that had always trusted her son, still wanted to believe Daniel was just grieving, just clumsy in his words. Still, as I held that envelope, I knew something inside me had shifted. A crack had formed deep and spreading in the trust between mother and son. And though I couldn't name it yet, I felt the ground under my feet starting to tremble. Sunday morning came with the kind of Colorado sunshine that should have lifted my spirits. But instead, I felt a tightness in my chest as I walked up the stone steps of St. Andrew's Church. For decades, Robert and I had sat in the third pew from the front, our hands brushing as we sang hymns together. Now I walked in alone, clutching my Bible like a shield. Olivia had offered to come, but I insisted I was fine. I thought maybe the familiar comfort of worship would steady me. The moment I stepped inside, though, I felt eyes on me. Conversations hushed, then resumed in whispers. Smiles that usually came easily seemed forced pitying. I tried to ignore it, moving toward my usual pew. Pastor John Mitchell, tall and silver-haired at 70, met me at the aisle. His hand was warm, but his eyes carried a weight I didn't expect. "Margaret," he said gently, "how are you holding up? It must be a difficult adjustment, especially with everything going on." I frowned. "Everything going on." He hesitated, his thumb rubbing against my palm as though choosing his words carefully. "I've just heard, well, some people are saying you've been struggling with your memory, that it might be time for family to step in." The words hit me harder than any sermon ever had. My breath caught in my throat. Struggling with my memory, I repeated my voice sharper than I intended. Pastor John's gaze flickered, almost apologetic. "Please don't take it the wrong way. Folks just worry. I'm sure Daniel means well." "Daniel? Of course. Who else would plant such poison?" I pulled my hand away and forced a smile, though my cheeks burned. "Thank you for your concern, Pastor," I said tightly, and made my way down the aisle. Each step felt heavier, as though the wooden floorboards themselves carried judgment. I slid into the pew, but I couldn't focus on the hymnals or the scripture. Around me, I saw glances, some sympathetic, some curious. Mrs. Thompson leaned over to whisper to her husband, and he nodded, his eyes darting toward me. A young mother offered me a smile that was tinged with pity, the kind you give someone you think is broken. Shame crawled up my neck. I wanted to stand and shout that I was not losing my mind, that I was the same woman who had balanced the accounts of Miller and Sons for decades, who had raised 2 children without missing a detail of their lives. Instead, I sat, frozen, my hands trembling against the worn Bible cover. When the service ended, Olivia appeared at my side, slipping her arm through mine. I hadn't even noticed her arrive. She guided me outside into the sunlight, away from the whispers. "Mom," she said, searching my face, "what happened in there? You look pale." I swallowed hard. "Pastor John asked if I was losing my memory. He said people were talking." Her jaw tightened. "Daniel," she muttered. "This has his fingerprints all over it. He's trying to build a case before you even know what's happening." I pressed a hand to my chest, still feeling the sting. I can't believe he would spread lies about me in our own church. These people watched me raise him. Olivia stopped at the edge of the parking lot, her eyes fierce. "Then it's time we stop playing nice. You need protection. You need someone who knows how to fight this kind of thing. I know an attorney. Emily Carter. She's handled estate disputes for families around here. She'll see through Daniel's games." I hesitated. "A lawyer." "Olivia, that feels extreme. What's extreme," she shot back, "is your own son trying to strip you of everything Dad left and making the community believe you can't even remember your own name. If you don't fight back now, it'll only get worse." Her conviction steadied me, but only slightly. My hand still shook as I clutched the car door handle. Around us, parishioners filtered out of the church, their conversations drifting like smoke. I caught snippets. Such a shame she used to be so strong, poor woman. Every word pierced me. As Olivia drove us home, I stared out the window at the familiar streets of Boulder, the tidy houses with their manicured lawns. I had lived here nearly 4 decades, built a life, a reputation. Now, in the span of days, Daniel had smeared it with a single whisper. When we reached the driveway, Olivia turned off the engine and faced me. "Mom, I'll make the call to Emily tomorrow. Just promise me you won't let Daniel corner you again. Not until we have someone in our corner." I nodded slowly, the humiliation of that morning still burning inside me. The image of the congregation's eyes, heavy with pity, would not leave me. I had walked into church hoping for comfort, and walked out branded as a woman losing her mind. That night, as I lay awake in the silence of my empty bed, I realized the battle I thought was private had already spilled into the open. My son wasn't just pushing papers in my living room. He was dragging my name through the very community that had once upheld me, and for the first time I felt the sharp sting of betrayal cut deeper than grief. I hesitated outside the red brick office on Pearl Street, smoothing my coat as though that would steady the trembling in my hands. The brass plate on the door read, "Emily Carter, Attorney at Law." I hadn't seen Emily in years, not since we were both fresh out of college. Back then I had chosen marriage and teaching while she had marched straight into law school. We had exchanged Christmas cards for a while, then drifted apart as life took us in different directions. And yet when Olivia mentioned her name, I felt a flicker of hope. Emily greeted me with the same warm smile I remembered, though her hair had gone silver, and her office was lined with shelves of thick legal books. "Margaret Miller," she said, drawing me into an embrace. I wish we were meeting under happier circumstances. I sat across from her, clutching my handbag in my lap. "I don't even know where to begin, Emily. It feels like my own son is turning against me." She folded her hands on the desk, her expression calm but intent. Olivia filled me in a little. "Let's take it step by step. First, you should know your husband's will is going to be read soon. Until then, nothing can be touched, not the company, not the accounts. Daniel might posture, but he cannot legally seize control." Relief rushed through me, though it was quickly followed by unease. "Robert was meticulous," I said softly. "I know he added something, a condition of some sort in his will, but he never told me exactly what it was." Emily nodded. "That could work in your favor. A conditional inheritance clause can prevent abuse, but we'll know more when it's read. For now, my job is to make sure you're protected." She leaned forward, her voice firm. "Do not sign anything Daniel gives you. Not a power of attorney, not a transfer document, nothing." I felt my eyes sting with tears. "He keeps saying I'm not capable anymore, that I should just let him handle it. And the church, people already think I'm losing my mind." Emily's expression softened. "Margaret, you are not alone in this. If Daniel pushes that narrative, I will challenge it. We can request medical evaluations, if necessary, testimony from those who know you. Don't let him gaslight you into doubting yourself." For the first time in weeks, I felt a small flame of strength. "Thank you, Emily. I just need someone in my corner." We began going over documents. Robert's life insurance property deeds the structure of Miller & Sons Construction. Emily's pen scratched notes as she explained which items would be settled through probate, which assets were jointly held. Her calm voice was like a lifeline, pulling me back from the edge of panic. Then, without warning, the office door burst open. Daniel strode in, his face flushed with anger, his tie askew as though he had come straight from a confrontation. "So, this is what you've been doing," he snapped, glaring at me. "Sneaking around, dragging outsiders into family business." I froze my throat tight. "Daniel, this is Emily Carter. She was my classmate, and she's helping me understand. Understand what he cut in." His eyes flicked to the desk, to the papers spread before us. "That you can't handle this yourself. That you'd rather trust some lawyer than your own son." Emily stood her presence steady, almost protective. "Mr. Miller, this is my office. Your mother has every right to legal counsel." But Daniel barely glanced at her. He leaned across the desk, his voice low but laced with venom. "You really are slipping, Mom. Only someone senile would let a stranger dictate family matters." The word cracked through the room like a whip. Senile. Not hinted, not implied. Said outright. My stomach dropped, and for a moment all I could hear was the pounding of my heart. Emily's chair scraped back as she rose fully, her tone sharp now. "That's enough. If you cannot speak respectfully, I will ask you to leave." Daniel straightened, brushing off her words with a scoff. "Fine. Go ahead, waste your money on lawyers. But don't expect me to clean up the mess when you can't even balance your checkbook anymore." He shot me one last look, cold and cutting, then stormed out the door, slamming behind him. The silence that followed felt deafening. I sat there, my hands trembling, tears threatening to spill. Emily reached across the desk, laying her hand gently over mine. "Don't let his cruelty define you." That was manipulation, plain and simple. I nodded, but inside I was reeling. The son I had raised, the boy I once sang lullabies to, had looked me in the eye and called me senile. The humiliation of it burned deeper than anything else. Emily squeezed my hand. "This only confirms what we suspected. He's building a case against you, but now we have evidence. His words, his behavior, it will backfire." I swallowed hard, drawing in a shaky breath. "I hope you're right, because I don't know how much longer I can bear this." She gave me a steady look. "Margaret, you've borne more in your life than most people could imagine. You are stronger than he realizes, and will prove it." I left the office with Olivia waiting outside in the car, the late afternoon sun glaring off the windshield. My daughter studied my face as I slid into the seat. "What happened in there?" she asked softly. I couldn't bring myself to repeat the word. Not yet. I only whispered, "He crossed a line." And as we drove away, I realized something had shifted irrevocably. Daniel hadn't just questioned me. He had declared war. The phone call came late in the evening, just as I was rinsing the dinner plates. I almost let it go to voicemail, but something in the hesitant ring made me answer. "Mrs. Miller?" a quiet voice asked. "It's Claire Thompson. From the office." I remembered Claire. Robert had hired her fresh out of college as a bookkeeper, and she had grown into a reliable accountant over the years. She was only 28 now, thoughtful, reserved, always polite when I visited the company. "Yes, Claire," I said, drying my hands on a dish towel. "What is it?" There was a pause. I probably shouldn't be calling, but I can't stay silent. Could we meet? Not at the office? Somewhere private? My heart sank. "Is something wrong with the company?" She lowered her voice. "It's Daniel. Please, can we meet tomorrow morning?" The next day we sat in a small coffee shop tucked off Main Street, the kind of place where no one paid much attention to two women talking quietly in a corner booth. Claire's hands wrapped tightly around her mug, her eyes darting as though she feared being overheard. "Daniel's been having meetings," she said finally, "not with clients. With Robert Miller from Summit Construction." I stiffened. Summit had always been our fiercest competitor, circling like vultures whenever H&R Builders had a slow season. Robert Miller was ambitious, ruthless, with a reputation for swallowing small companies whole. Meetings about what I asked, though, dread already curdled in my stomach. Claire's voice dropped. "A sale. Daniel's negotiating to sell the company. Your company. What you and your husband built." The words hung in the air, bitter as the coffee I could no longer swallow. For a moment, the world tilted, the sound of clinking dishes fading around me. "That can't be," I whispered. "The company is in probate. He doesn't have the authority." She nodded quickly. "I know, that's why it's been behind closed doors. But I saw a draft agreement on his desk. It had Daniel's signature at the bottom. He's serious, Mrs. Miller. He's trying to push it through before the will is read." My pulse thundered in my ears. That company was Robert's life's work. Every nail, Every beam, every late night had gone into H&R Builders. To think of it sold off reduced to a line item in Summit's portfolio. It felt like a second funeral. "Why are you telling me this?" I asked softly. Claire's eyes brimmed with something like guilt. "Because Mr. Hayes treated me like family. He gave me my start. I can't stand by and watch Daniel destroy everything. But if he finds out I came to you..." I reached across the table, covering her hand with mine. "You did the right thing. And I won't tell him. Not yet." That evening I told Olivia. She was pacing before I'd even finished the sentence, her fists clenched. "He's selling Dad's company to Summit, that snake. I'm going over there right now." I caught her arm. "No, not yet. If we confront him now, he'll bury the paperwork, deny everything. We need proof and we need timing." Olivia's eyes flashed with fury. "How can you stay calm? Mom, Dad's whole life. Our family's name." "He's throwing it away." "I'm not calm," I said, my voice breaking. "Inside I'm screaming. But if we rush this, Daniel wins. We wait for the will to be read. Until then, not a word." She sank onto the couch, her anger simmering into frustration. "So we just sit here while he guts the company?" "No," I said quietly. "We gather strength. We listen. We watch." Later that night, when the house had grown still, I sat in Robert's old armchair, staring at the framed photographs on the mantel. Robert in his hard hat. Olivia's first day at school. Daniel with his arm slung around his father's shoulder. My chest ached. I remembered the day Robert came home grinning and told me he'd hired Claire because she reminded him of me at that age. Smart, steady, eager to work hard. Now she had become my unlikely ally. But the image of that signed agreement wouldn't leave me. Daniel's name on a line meant betrayal, final and undeniable. He wasn't just posturing anymore. He was dismantling his father's legacy while the grave was still fresh. I closed my eyes, whispering into the silence. "Not yet, Robert. I won't let him win. But the time has to be right." Dinner that night was meant to be a chance to bring us together, at least for one evening. I had roasted chicken the way Robert used to love mashed potatoes with extra butter and green beans that Olivia had picked up fresh from the market. Olivia sat on one side of the table, Daniel on the other, his wife Melissa quietly refilling glasses, and Ethan in between them, swinging his legs and chattering about his soccer practice. For a moment it almost felt like the family dinners we used to have before everything fractured. But the illusion shattered the moment Ethan piped up, his voice sweet and innocent. "Grandma, Dad says you don't remember things anymore. Is that true?" The fork slipped from my hand, clattering against the plate. My breath caught in my throat. I looked across at Daniel, whose eyes remained fixed on his food, not even flinching. Melissa gave a nervous smile as if hoping to smooth over the question, but it was too late. I forced a smile for Ethan. "Sweetheart, I still remember plenty, more than your father realizes." But the ache in my chest was unbearable. To hear those words echoed from my grandson's mouth. Proof that Daniel's poison had seeped even into the next generation. Olivia's eyes widened in fury. "Daniel, are you serious? You told your son that you're using Ethan to spread your lies now." Daniel leaned back in his chair, his jaw tight. "I told him the truth. He deserves to know what's happening in this family." "The truth." Olivia's voice rose sharp as a blade. "The truth is Mom is grieving and you're exploiting it. You're planting stories so you can get your hands on Dad's money." Daniel slammed his palm against the table, rattling the silverware. "Don't you dare lecture me. I'm the one trying to keep this family afloat. The company is bleeding, bills are piling up, and Mom can't handle it. Someone has to step up." Melissa placed a hand on his arm, murmuring, "Daniel, please." But he shrugged her off. I tried to steady my voice. "Daniel, all I ever wanted was for you and Olivia to share what your father built to honor it. But this deceit, these rumors, it's tearing us apart." His gaze locked on me hard and unyielding. What's tearing us apart is you refusing to face reality. You can't keep up anymore, Mom. You're clinging to control you don't deserve. Olivia pushed back her chair, her face flushed. How dare you talk to her like that? She gave up her career for this family. She supported Dad every step of the way, and you sit here spitting in her face. Daniel stood now, towering over the table, his voice thundering. I won't let her ruin my future. That inheritance, those $52 million are mine, not some senile old woman's. The words exploded into the room like a bomb. Ethan froze his fork halfway to his mouth, eyes wide. Melissa covered her face with her hands. My whole body went cold, my stomach twisting. To hear him say it aloud with such venom stripped away any illusion of family left at that table. Olivia stepped between us, her voice shaking with rage. She's not senile. She's your mother. And if you think you can bully her into giving you everything, you're delusional. Daniel's face darkened. His fists clenched. For a terrifying moment, I thought he might strike the table again. Or worse. Instead, he grabbed his jacket from the back of the chair and stormed toward the door, muttering under his breath. The slam of the front door echoed through the house, leaving behind a silence so thick it was hard to breathe. Ethan sat frozen, tears brimming in his eyes. I gathered him into my arms, whispering, You don't need to worry about Grandma. I'm just fine. But inside I was breaking. That night, as I lay awake staring at the ceiling, the words replayed over and over, 52 million, senile old woman. My own son had reduced me to a number and an insult. And I knew then that this wasn't just about money or control, it was about dignity. Mine, Robert's, and the family we once were. And Daniel was willing to burn it all to the ground. The morning after that disastrous dinner, I sat in Emily Carter's office, my hands clasped tightly in my lap. Sunlight filtered through the blinds, cutting across the stacks of case files on her desk. Emily had aged gracefully. Her sharp eyes were the same as when we sat side by side in college lectures, but now they carried the calm confidence of decades in the courtroom. She listened patiently as I recounted every detail, Claire's warning, the blocked credit cards, Daniel's outburst in front of Ethan. When I finished, Emily leaned back in her chair, tapping a pen against her legal pad. We're going to need proof, she said firmly. Claire's testimony is a start. If she's willing to sign a statement about what she saw, it'll carry weight. As for the accounts, I can subpoena records, but it would be better if we can show evidence that Daniel already tampered with your finances. I nodded, my throat dry. My debit card was declined last week at the pharmacy. I thought it was an error. Then Daniel handed me cash like he was giving me an allowance. Emily's lips pressed into a thin line. That's financial control, classic groundwork for a guardianship petition. If he can convince the court you're incompetent, he'll be granted control over your estate. We have to stay ahead of him. The word incompetent stung. I felt my cheeks flush anger mixing with humiliation. I'm not incompetent. I've run a household, balanced books, and kept this family together for 40 years. He wants to paint me as some frail old woman to get what Robert left. Emily reached across the desk, resting her hand briefly on mine. And we're going to make sure that doesn't happen. That night, after Olivia had gone home and the house was quiet, I went through Robert's study. His leather chair still carried the faint smell of his aftershave, and the bookshelves were lined with decades of company ledgers. I pulled open drawers, searching for anything that might help. That's when I found the envelope tucked inside the bottom drawer of his desk, beneath a stack of old tax returns. My heart pounded as I slid it out, recognizing his neat handwriting. For Margaret, if I'm gone. I sat down heavily, my hands trembling as I unfolded the letter. My dearest Margaret, it began. If you are reading this, I am no longer there to sit across from you in the evenings. I have spent my life building H&R Builders, but more importantly, I have spent my life with you. The company should remain in the family, but only if the family keeps its honor. That is why I left a condition in the will. Our children will inherit, but not without proof of character. I trust you to protect this legacy until the right one earns it. tears blurred the ink as I read his words again and again. Proof of character, a condition in the will. For the first time in weeks, a flicker of hope stirred in my chest. Robert hadn't left me defenseless. He had seen the possibility of greed, of division, and had prepared for it. I pressed the letter to my heart, whispering, "You knew Robert. You knew this day might come." The next morning, I brought the letter to Emily. She read it silently, her brow furrowed. When she finished, she looked up with a spark in her eyes. "This changes everything. If the will has a condition, Daniel can't simply grab control no matter what stories he spreads. We need to see the full document when it's read. Until then, this letter is our beacon." Olivia sat beside me, relief softening her features for the first time in weeks. So Dad thought of this. He actually built in a safeguard. "Yes," I whispered, gripping her hand. He knew what mattered most wasn't the money. It was dignity. That night, as I placed Robert's letter carefully in my nightstand, I felt the shift inside me. Fear had ruled my days since his passing, but now determination took its place. Daniel thought he had control, that his lies and manipulations would break me down, but Robert had left me more than memories. He had left me a weapon hidden in plain sight, a promise that greed would not go unpunished. And for the first time since the funeral, I slept with a sense of strength returning, knowing the fight was far from over. The courthouse in downtown Denver smelled faintly of polish and paper, a mix of age and authority. My heels clicked against the marble floor as Olivia steadied me by the elbow, though I didn't need it. Emily walked at my other side, her briefcase swinging, her expression calm but sharp. Inside the probate courtroom, the wooden benches were half filled with familiar faces. Pastor John nodded solemnly from the second row. Behind him I saw Claire, her gaze lowered as if she hoped not to be noticed. Even a few longtime employees from H&R Builders had come, their whispers fading as I entered. I felt their eyes follow me, measuring, wondering. Daniel was already seated at the petitioner's table, crisp suit hair combed perfectly, a smirk tugging at the corner of his mouth. Beside him, his attorney, a slick man with a navy tie, flipped through a folder of papers. Daniel didn't even look at me. Judge Karen Lopez entered promptly at 9, her black robe brushing the floor as she settled behind the bench. "This court will now read the will and testament of Richard Hayes," she announced, her voice clear and firm. For a moment, hearing Robert's name in that sterile room made my throat tighten. But I sat straight, clasping my hands in my lap. The clerk began to read the opening pages, legal language that blurred together. I barely heard the standard phrases about debts and property. My pulse quickened with each word, waiting for the section I knew Robert had shaped with care. But Daniel couldn't wait. He stood suddenly, his chair scraping the floor. "Your Honor," he said loudly, cutting through the reading, "before we waste more time, I need to raise an issue of competency. My mother is no longer capable of making sound decisions. She forgets details, mismanages her own accounts, and relies entirely on my sister to handle simple matters. She should not be recognized as a party to this inheritance dispute." The room went still. A murmur rippled through the benches. Pastor John shifted uncomfortably. Claire lifted her eyes, her face pale. Heat surged into my cheeks. I gripped the edge of the table, willing myself not to tremble. Emily rose smoothly beside me. "Objection, Your Honor. These are unsubstantiated allegations. Mrs. Hayes is present, alert and fully capable. We ask that this slander be stricken from the record." Judge Lopez lifted a hand, silencing the noise, her eyes fixed on Daniel. "Mr. Hayes, unless you provide medical evidence, this line of argument is premature. Sit down." But Daniel wasn't finished. He turned, gesturing toward me as though parading me before the crowd. "Ask anyone here, they've seen it. My own son knows she can't remember conversations. She can't keep up with the business. Well, she's confused and fragile. I am simply protecting my father's legacy." The words landed like blows. I saw Olivia stiffen beside me, fury burning in her eyes. She gripped my hand so tightly it hurt. I wanted to speak to defend myself, but Emily placed a hand on my arm, shaking her head ever so slightly. "Not yet," she whispered. "Let him hang himself." The judge's gavel cracked. "Enough. This court will proceed with the reading of the will. Mr. Hayes, you will have the chance to make arguments later. But let me be clear. Character attacks will not substitute for evidence." Daniel sat his jaw tight, but he smirked as though he had planted the seed he wanted. And as the clerk resumed reading Robert's words, I felt the weight of every eye in the room shift toward me, heavy with doubt and pity. It was the same look I had seen in church, the same whispers behind closed doors. And now it was written into the record of this courtroom, my own son claiming I was unfit. I straightened my back and fixed my gaze on the judge. My voice stayed locked in my chest, but inside one thought burned steady. Robert's letter, the condition in the will. That was my anchor, my shield. The courtroom air felt colder, the wood harder beneath me, but I sat tall, refusing to bow under Daniel's accusation. If he wanted to paint me as weak, he would have to work harder. Still, as the clerk's voice droned on, I could feel the tension climbing like a storm about to break. This was only the beginning. The clerk cleared his throat and adjusted his glasses, his voice steady as he read from the final pages of Robert's will. "To my beloved wife, Margaret Hayes, I leave 50% of my estate, including personal assets, savings, and shared properties. To my son, Daniel Hayes, I leave 25%. To my daughter, Olivia Hayes, I leave 25%. As for H&R Builders, the company I founded and nurtured since 1985, it shall remain within the family only under the condition that its leadership demonstrates both competence and integrity. The right to direct and control the company will belong solely to the heir who proves worthy of protecting its reputation and legacy." The courtroom held its breath. Even the hum of the fluorescent lights seemed louder. Daniel's face drained of color, then flushed an angry red. He shot up from his chair, his voice sharp. "This is absurd. My father built that company with me at his side. Everyone knows I'm the natural successor. My mother can barely balance a checkbook. My sister hasn't stepped foot on a construction site. This condition is nothing but a game to keep me from what is rightfully mine." Judge Lopez banged her gavel once. "Sit down, Mr. Hayes." But he didn't. He slammed his hand on the table, rattling the water glasses. $52 million, and half of it goes to someone who doesn't understand business. And then this nonsense about honor and competence. My father wouldn't have done this. This has to be manipulated. "Daniel." My voice steady, though my hands shook, cut through the noise. I rose slowly, Emily by my side. For weeks I had endured his smirks, his whispers, his slander. But this moment was different. I reached into my bag and pulled out the folder Emily had urged me to bring. With deliberate calm, I held up a document. "Your Honor, with the court's permission, I would like to submit new evidence. This pertains directly to Mr. Hayes's claim of competence and integrity." Emily handed the folder to the bailiff, who brought it to the judge. Judge Lopez flipped through the pages, her brow furrowing. "These," Emily said firmly, "are copies of a draft agreement between Mr. Daniel Hayes and Mr. Robert Miller, CEO of Summit Construction. The document outlines the potential sale of H&R Builders. Signed by Mr. Hayes despite the fact he does not yet hold legal authority over the company." Gasps rippled across the courtroom. Pastor John shook his head in disbelief. Claire, sitting quietly in the back row, looked down at her hands, her shoulders tense. Daniel's attorney sprang to his feet. "Objection, Your Honor. These documents could have been fabricated. We've seen no verification." But Emily cut in before he could finish. "The original draft was witnessed by Claire Thompson, the company's accountant, who is present in this courtroom. She is prepared to testify under oath that Mr. Hayes not only signed this document, but intended to finalize the sale immediately upon securing guardianship over his mother." Daniel spun around, his eyes locking on Claire like daggers. "You little traitor," he hissed. Claire didn't flinch, though her face was pale. She raised her chin, her voice trembling but clear. "It's true. I saw him sign it. He told me not to say anything, that it was just business. But it wasn't his business to sell. The silence that followed was deafening. Daniel's fists clenched at his sides, his chest rising and falling with fury. "You're all against me. You've been plotting this since Dad died." Judge Lopez's gavel struck sharply. "Order, Mr. Hayes, sit down, or you will be removed from this courtroom. This evidence will be admitted and we will hear the testimony in full." I lowered myself back into my chair, my pulse racing. For the first time, Daniel's confidence cracked in public view. He had spent weeks painting me as senile, unfit, a shadow of myself. But now, in front of the judge, the community, and our family, his mask slipped. I glanced at Olivia, who was biting back tears, her hand gripping mine tightly. For the first time since Robert's funeral, I felt the weight begin to shift. Daniel had wanted to show me as weak, but here I was, standing with evidence in hand, and he was the one unraveling. The reading of the will was finished, but the battle had only just begun. And as Judge Lopez adjourned for the day, the echoes of Claire's words lingered in the air, casting a shadow Daniel could no longer control. The next morning, the courtroom felt heavier, as though the walls themselves held the tension from the day before. Emily arranged her papers in neat stacks, her calm confidence radiating beside me. Daniel sat across the aisle, tapping his pen impatiently, his lawyer whispering in his ear. He looked like a man cornered, and in truth, he was. Judge Lopez entered and called the session to order. "We will continue with testimony and evidence regarding the estate of Robert Hayes and the conditions of his will." Emily stood first, her voice firm. "Your Honor, yesterday, Mr. Hayes raised repeated allegations of his mother's mental incompetence. To counter these claims, we submit medical documentation from Dr. Leonard Price, a licensed physician who examined Mrs. Hayes last month. These records confirm that she is in sound mental health with no diagnosis of dementia, memory loss, or impairment. In fact, her cognitive scores rank above average for her age." The bailiff carried the folder to the bench. The judge scanned the pages, her expression unreadable. Daniel's lawyer jumped up. "Medical reports can be subjective. Your Honor, memory lapses are not always captured in routine exams." Emily turned to face him. "Then let us rely on testimony from those who know her best." She looked to the back of the courtroom. "We call Pastor John Mitchell to the stand." The pastor rose slowly, his age showing in the stiffness of his movements, but his voice was steady as he swore the oath. Settling into the witness chair, he folded his hands. "Pastor Mitchell, Emily began, you've known Mrs. Hayes for over 30 years, correct?" "Yes, since she and her husband joined our congregation. In your experience, has she ever shown signs of confusion, memory loss, or inability to manage her life?" He shook his head firmly. "No. Margaret is as sharp as ever. She still leads the women's group, keeps the church accounts balanced, and teaches Sunday school when asked. The idea that she's losing her mind is not only false, it's cruel." Emily leaned closer. "Have you heard otherwise?" The pastor's lips pressed into a thin line. "Yes. Daniel approached several members of the congregation in recent weeks, telling them his mother was senile. He said she couldn't be trusted with money, that she was unstable." I found it deeply troubling. A murmur spread through the courtroom. I lowered my eyes, a mix of shame and anger burning in my chest. My own son smearing me to my community. Daniel's lawyer objected, "Hearsay," but the judge overruled him. "The witness has direct knowledge of these statements. The objection is denied." Pastor John's words hung in the air like a bell tolling. Emily sat back, satisfied. Daniel's lawyer tried to recover, asking the pastor if perhaps he'd misheard, but the old man didn't waver. "I know what I heard, and I know the intent." When the testimony ended, Emily rose again. "Your Honor, the will's condition is clear." Leadership of H&R Builders requires not just skill but integrity. Mr. Hayes has demonstrated neither. He attempted to sell the company without authority. He slandered his own mother in public and private to seize control. These actions violate the very spirit of Robert Hayes's final wishes. Daniel shot up from his chair. That's a lie. I was protecting what's mine. I'm the only one who understands that business. Mr. Hayes? Judge Lopez cut him off, her voice like steel enough. She paused, glancing at the documents and then at me. Her gaze softened for a moment before hardening again. This court finds that Mr. Daniel Hayes has acted in bad faith in direct conflict with the conditions laid out in his father's will, effective immediately. Mr. Hayes is stripped of any right to exercise authority over H&R Builders. The company's stewardship will be determined according to the provisions of the will with consideration for both competence and honor. A stunned silence filled the room. Daniel's face twisted fury and disbelief mixing until he looked like a stranger to me. He slammed his hand against the table, muttering under his breath. But the gavel struck sharply. Order! This decision is final for today's proceedings. We will reconvene tomorrow to establish next steps. I exhaled slowly, my heart hammering. It wasn't over yet, but for the first time in weeks, I felt Robert's presence at my side, as if his words in that letter had carried me through. Daniel glared across the aisle, his eyes promising retaliation, but his voice, loud, commanding, untouchable, was gone. All that remained was the echo of the judge's ruling, stripped of power, exposed for who he had become. Psychics. News traveled faster than I ever imagined. Within days of the court's decision, whispers turned into headlines in Denver's business circles. Robert Miller, the man Daniel had been courting to sell H&R Builders, announced he was withdrawing from any discussion. His statement was clear and public. I have no interest in engaging with someone willing to disregard his father's legacy and undermine his own family. When I read those words in the paper, I sat at the kitchen table with my coffee growing cold, my hands trembling slightly. It wasn't just relief. It was justice unfolding in real time. Daniel's name, once associated with ambition and drive, now carried the stain of betrayal. Calls from longtime business partners stopped coming. A project manager emailed me privately saying, "Mrs. Hayes, we always knew Richard built that company on trust. Now everyone knows you carry that same integrity. We'd stand with you, not Daniel." I saved that email, reading it more than once on the hard nights when doubt still crept in. Olivia, steady as always, leaned into her role with courage. She used her inheritance to reinvest in the company, taking on meetings with staff who feared for their jobs. Together we walked through the dusty offices Richard had poured his life into, and for the first time since his passing, I felt a sense of purpose rise up again. Olivia looked at me one evening after a long day and said, "Mom, Dad would be proud. We're doing this the right way." I could only nod, my throat tightening. For so long I had felt erased, but now I was part of building again, not just surviving. Sunday morning at church, Pastor John met me near the steps, his warm hand gripping mine. His eyes carried none of the pity I had seen weeks before. Instead, there was respect, almost reverence. "Margaret," he said gently, "truth has a way of finding its light. People see you clearly now. They know the lies Daniel spread. What remains is the dignity you never lost." Behind him, members of the congregation nodded, offering small smiles and quiet greetings. No longer whispers about senility, no sideways glances of doubt. Only welcome. My chest lifted with a breath I hadn't realized I was holding. Inside, as the hymns filled the air, I closed my eyes and felt Robert's presence, steady and reassuring. For the first time since his funeral, I prayed not out of desperation, but out of gratitude. After the service, as we lingered by the pews, I felt a tug at my sleeve. Ethan's bright face tilted up to mine, his arms wrapping around me with the innocence only a child can carry. "Grandma," he whispered into my coat, "Dad was wrong. You're not forgetful at all." "You're the smartest person I know." The words undid me. Tears spilled before I could stop them, hot against my cheeks, and I pulled him close, burying my face in his hair. For all the battles in courtrooms and boardrooms, this was the moment that mattered most. Standing there, surrounded by my daughter, my grandson, my community, I felt something I hadn't in a long time. Vindication. Not the sharp, vengeful kind, but the quiet peace of knowing that truth had won, that dignity had endured, and that the people who mattered finally saw me for who I truly was. The tears kept falling, but they were no longer from sorrow. They were the tears of a woman finally freed. When the courtroom battles ended, and the gossip finally quieted, I found myself standing alone in my living room one afternoon, sunlight streaming across the worn oak floors Richard once polished with his own hands. The silence wasn't heavy anymore. It was calm, almost welcoming. For the first time in months, I could simply breathe. I thought back to the moment I held Robert's hand for the last time, the promises whispered in the hospital room, the weight of grief that nearly broke me when he was gone. Those days felt like another lifetime now. I had survived being dismissed as fragile, ignored, as irrelevant, accused of being senile. I had stood my ground and carried Richard's legacy with my own voice. Olivia came by often, and together we walked through the halls of H&R Builders, planning projects and listening to the hum of loyal employees who had chosen to stay. We agreed not to sell, but to preserve what Richard built, investing in new tools, training younger workers, and keeping the name Hayes tied to honesty. Watching my daughter step forward as a leader gave me a quiet joy. She wasn't just defending a company, she was defending her father's memory, and in a way defending me. Yet I knew life had to be more than meetings, contracts, and balance sheets. One morning, as I poured myself a cup of tea, I made a decision. I would take a portion of my inheritance and see the places Richard and I once dreamed about but never had the time to visit. Paris in the spring, the rolling hills of Ireland, the red deserts of Arizona. I owed myself more than survival. I owed myself living. Olivia supported me immediately. "Mom, you've carried everyone for so long. Now it's time for you to carry yourself." Her words made me smile because they were the echo of what Richard used to tell me whenever I pushed my own needs aside. I planned my first trip to Maine, where I would sit on the rocky shore and watch the waves crash against the cliffs. A simple beginning. I wanted to feel small again in the best way, reminded that life was wider than the pain of betrayal. At church, Pastor John clasped my hand once more. "Margaret," he said softly, "you've shown us all that strength doesn't have to be loud. It just has to be steady." His blessing stayed with me as I prepared to step into this new chapter of life. Ethan still ran into my arms whenever he saw me, and each time he did, I felt assured that despite the fractures Daniel had left behind, love could mend what mattered most. My grandson would grow up knowing that his grandmother was not broken, not diminished, but whole. Now, when I sit at my kitchen table, I no longer count what was taken from me. I count what remains: my dignity, my daughter's loyalty, my grandson's love, my community's respect, and the freedom to choose how I live the years ahead. I had been tested in the cruelest way, but I emerged not bitter, not hardened, but at peace. And to every woman listening who has ever been told she is less, who has been called forgetful, irrelevant, or a burden, believe this: your dignity cannot be stolen. If you have ever been dismissed, stand tall in your truth. Share your story, let your voice be heard, and never doubt your worth. Because as I've learned, strength doesn't always roar. Sometimes it simply endures. And in that endurance lies the quiet victory of being fully, undeniably yourself.